Hello, everyone. You're all very welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's Coffee Conversation series. It is Wednesday, September 8th, 2021. My name is Kimberly Griffith Walsh, and I'm here today to talk to you about the painting Marionettes at the Window by Dorothy Blackham. I am an artist and art historian on the gallery's panel of artist guides and lectures, and I'm going to go ahead and minimize myself now so we can get started with our talk. So to start off, this is a work of tempera on paper. It measures approximately 53.2 by 36.9 centimeters, and it was presented to the gallery by the artist's sister, Mrs. Thea Boyd, through Dr. Elizabeth Fitzpatrick in 1977. And I'll touch a little bit on why I think it's important to, in this case, note where how the painting made its way into the gallery's collection towards the end of the talk. But just to say that Elizabeth Fitzpatrick was also part of the Purser family, who is also, of course, very significant to the gallery and particularly to its founding. Looking now at the visuals of the painting, so it shows three puppets that are hanging and swinging in a breeze in front of a slightly opened window. The view through the window shows an urban scene of roofs with a church spire in the distance. The window itself, or the surrounds of the sash window, are painted in I would call it a light navy or cornflower blue color. And the marionettes themselves seem to be quite lively, so they're almost imbued with a sense of life and mischief that we wouldn't necessarily expect to find in an inanimate object. And the reason that I mention this is because the artist who painted the piece, Dorothy Blackham, is more known for her landscape painting. So I think it's interesting to look at this as an example of her work because it would be sort of out of the ordinary in terms of what she's known for in the art historical canon, which, to be fair, she isn't often mentioned in it either, which we'll also talk a little bit about. But I just wanted to start by taking a minute to look at the marionettes themselves. So we have three marionettes here, and they occupy most of the right side of the canvas, and then they all seem to be sort of suspended in the midst of some sort of action. It's as though they might even be trying to escape from the window into the city streets below. So they all also have specific costumes or specific dress and characters that kind of also, I think, emphasize the sense of character that we get through them in this sense of liveliness. So on the bottom, we have a marionette who appears to be female, and she's in some sort of peasant costume. She wears a long rust orange colored tunic over a dark green skirt with a white or cream colored apron tied around her waist, and she is suspended below and almost reaching up towards two marionettes that appear to be male that are also suspended almost in the midst of falling or climbing or something like that. And the marionette on the left side appears to be in some sort of oriental costume. He has a thin mustache with what we would call an oriental or far east style hat and trousers and that sort of costume, whereas the marionette on to the right of him appears to be in some sort of European clown or jester costume. And all of this, I think, just adds to the characterization of the scene. And as I mentioned, Dorothy Blackham would have been more well known for her landscape paintings in oils and in watercolors. And one aspect of that I think comes through in this scene, which is definitely not a landscape painting, is the use of light and the artist's attention to light. So we can see her really paying attention to light and shadow here, and the way that the light is shining onto the marionettes, but also the shadow across particularly the bottom figure's skirt. And if you look really closely, you can even see the different colors from the light and shadow that are kind of playing off of her skirt. So the more that you look at it, the more I think this comes forward. So in addition to that sort of bottle green color, you can see sort of a navy blue almost imprint of her leg in its stocking on that would be her left leg, I think, the one that's sort of hanging down. And then in the portion of the skirt that's sort of going in front of the sash window, we can almost see the transparency of the blue color of the window itself almost shining through from the light behind it onto her green skirt. So sort of creating a play of color there as well, which I think would speak to her skill as a landscape painter and these processes of observing light and shadow also. And I think that the medium of tempera paint in particular would really lend itself to being able to capture this quality of light moving through fabric and the shadows of the object behind it, because tempera would be less opaque of a quality of paint than oil paints, for example. So you'd be able to sort of build up these layers of transparency and color. And it's really a great way, I think, to sort of capture that play of light and shadow. But before I continue talking about the painting, I actually wanted to backtrack a little bit and just take a little look at Dorothy Blackham herself, at her backstory, and as much as I could piece together of her autobiography, which I will say before I get going that it was quite difficult to do. There's not a lot of information of autobiographical or really any information about Dorothy Blackham's artistic practice as well, kind of readily available. So it was a bit of detective work on my part, and I sort of pieced together what I could to get kind of a picture of who the artist was as a person, what her interests were in terms of her artistic practice as well. So I'll just take a moment to look at that for a little while before returning to the painting. So Dorothy Blackham was born in Dublin on the 1st of March in 1896 at number 4 Beechwood Road in Rathmines. And she would have come, for as far as I can tell, a relatively well-to-do family, and there were a lot of artists in her family as well. And it seems that from a young age, she possessed a certain sensitivity and a certain attention to the world around her, and to just paying attention to stories and wanting to even to even record things for posterity, almost like the sense of a young archivist as well as an artist. And what I mean when I say that is I'm thinking specifically of an anecdote that Elizabeth L. Fitzpatrick, Dr. Fitzpatrick, the same person who assisted in helping to donate marionettes at the window to the gallery, in an article that Dr. Fitzpatrick wrote after Dorothy Blackham's passing, she starts with an anecdote of herself meeting with the artist a year before her death. And during this meeting, Dorothy Blackham showed Dr. Fitzpatrick a little notebook, which the artist had made at the age of 12 years old. And it was just a small notebook that contained excerpts from letters that Dorothy Blackham had been shown on a visit to a relative's house at Ballymont House in Clondalkin, in which one of her relations, who was a boy of about 16 at the time, she saw these letters that he'd written around 1798. And among much talk of horses and other things, there's also this detailed account of the house being raided for arms by insurgents, and how in the absence of his seniors, the 16-year-old boy had all the domestic staff crowded into his bedroom for protection. And Elizabeth Fitzpatrick just uses that as an example of the fact that Dorothy Blackham felt compelled to record this at the tender age of 12 years old, and how this illustrates perfectly her intelligence, her historical sense, and her application all at a remarkably early age. So I suppose this desire, even at the early age of 12 years old, to kind of record this piece of her family's history for posterity, to me, and I think was Elizabeth Fitzpatrick's point as well, lends itself to this sort of artistic predisposition. So as I mentioned, a lot of people in Dorothy Blackham's family were artists, and she had several cousins who were artists, and two of which were sisters and art teachers, one of the sisters working in Dublin and one in London. The sister who was working in Dublin was Mary Wharton, and she ended up being Dorothy Blackham's teacher, or one of her early teachers. And she taught at many schools throughout Dublin, and Dorothy Blackham was one of her pupils. In addition to this, Dorothy Blackham also trained at the RHA with Dermot O'Brien from 1916 to 1921. And it seems to me that if she was training under Dermot O'Brien at this time, she likely would have been taught at least a little bit in the manner of the Impressionists at the time too. And I think we get a really good example of that in this painting, which is called A Floral Garden, and it's a work of oil on canvas. Following her study at the Metropolitan School of Art, she then studied at Goldsmiths College in London from 1921 to 1922. And after her artistic study, she continued to paint quite prolifically, and she became a teacher as well. And when her cousin Mary Wharton, who was one of her early teachers, retired, Dorothy Blackham ended up getting Mary Wharton's teaching post at Nightingale Hall, which was one of the schools she taught at. Nightingale Hall was a private school in Dublin on Clyde Road. And Dorothy Blackham ended up teaching there for a good while, up until World War II. And it was the majority of, I'd say, her teaching career at that time. Though she was quite prolific, and though, as we'll see, she was sort of running in the same social circles and friends with a lot of the predominant artists at the time that we speak of when we talk about the art historical period of the early modern period in Ireland around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, Dorothy Blackham herself doesn't seem to have been very well remembered in terms of history and art history in particular. There's not a lot of biographical information available about her, and perhaps this is partially because she notably didn't really talk a lot about herself or her artistic practice. It just doesn't seem to have been in her nature. However, she was interviewed by Theo Snoddy for the Dictionary of Irish Art, and she's also mentioned in the volume Irish Women Artists from the 18th Century to Present Day, which accompanied the eponymous exhibition put on by the National Gallery of Ireland and the Douglas Hyde Gallery in 1987. So we do see mention of her in these volumes and texts, especially when we're looking at kind of female artists around that time period, though she doesn't seem to be particularly singled out. However, as I said, Dorothy Blackham was quite prolific in terms of her artistic practice, and in addition to this, she seems to have been quite successful and well known in her time, which is to say that she was working a lot. She exhibited regularly with the RHA from 1916 to 1946, so for a good 30-year period there, and she was also a member of the Society of Dublin Painters, in addition to being associated with other groups that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But one of the things that I think is perhaps the most interesting about Dorothy Blackham's autobiography is that she was also awarded silver medals for her works at the Tailteann Games of 1928 and 1932. And just to briefly explain the Tailteann festivals or the Tailteann Games for those of you who might not be familiar with it, they were an Irish sporting and cultural festival that were held in the Irish Free State in 1924, 1928, and 1932. And it was a revival or a modern revival of the Tailteann Games held from legendary times that were held basically up until the Norman invasion of Ireland, and are thought by many to actually be older, to predate the Olympic Games. And so the revival of the Tailteann Games also drew inspiration from the modern Olympics as well, from the revival of the ancient Olympics in Greece. The opening ceremonies were held in Crow Park, and in addition to sporting events, which were open to anyone of Irish birth or ancestry, there were also artistic competitions and industrial displays as well. And the idea of reviving the Tailteann Games were particularly adopted enthusiastically by the cultural nationalist movement that blossomed towards the end of the 19th century as well. However, eventually the Games did become regarded as a Cumann na nGaedheal project when that party lost power to Fianna Fáil after the 1932 election. So there wasn't further backing for the Tailteann Games after, I think it was 1932. So there were two successful iterations of the revival, and then one that's sort of viewed as being less successful. And because of this and different political reasons, the Games didn't continue. But just to say that in the 1928 and 1932 iterations of these Games, Dorothy Blackham earned a silver medal for her artwork. So she must have been quite successful at that time. Anyways, I mean, it's essentially the equivalent of almost like winning an Olympic silver medal, I'd say. And I think that maybe one of the reasons as to why Dorothy Blackham was successful was because of the particular Irishness in terms of the subject matter of her landscapes. Though she also spent some time living and working in London, Dorothy Blackham's work really seems to have been rooted in Ireland. And that's to say that most of her subjects are Irish, especially depicting the west and the north of Ireland. And she has many works depicting Achill as well, which is where her sister Thea settled. So the work that we're looking at right now is one of my favorites of her works that I came across. It's part of the collection of Queen's University Belfast, and it shows Keele, Achill, and County Mayo. And I think that this is perhaps a particularly interesting work to look at of Dorothy Blackham's because some of the criticism, I suppose, against her against her artwork is that she was perhaps not as progressive as some of her counterparts, specifically artists like Mamie Jellett and Mary Swansea and the like, and she wasn't particularly remembered for being very modern thinking. But I think that that's sort of an interesting criticism, because I think when you look at works like this one, you do see influences of modern styles. I think there's an influence of postmodernism here, of post-impressionism here, that we see in the way she's applied paint to the canvas and the geometric nature of the buildings here. And also, I think it's notable to say that one of the reasons that she received her teaching post at Nightingale Hall, the private school, was because the director of the school at that time was confident that she would be able to carry on teaching in the modern style, in the style that she'd learned from her cousin, Miss Wharton. So there seems to be a bit of a discontinuity there, and I suppose, be of the opinion that though she isn't necessarily working in cubism or in abstraction or any of these, very modern techniques, we do see modern elements like Impressionism, as we saw in the earlier canvas, and Post-Impressionism, and those sorts of styles here, as well as a very, I think, intuitive and very thoughtful use of color as well. She seems to be very successful as a colorist, and I think you can also see that in Marionettes at the Window, too. And as I mentioned, she was a member of, such progressive groups as the Dublin Painters Society, which was originally founded by Grace and Paul Henry as an alternative venue for the RHA for young painters to show that work that was meant to be, I suppose, less restrictive and less repressive than the RHA and its very specific policies and aesthetic ideas at the time. In fact, even these perhaps more progressive artists like Mamie Jellett and Mary Swansea both spoke highly of Dorothy Blackham and her work. Mary Swansea is quoted to have said that Dorothy Blackham knows everything, so whatever that means, I think it means that she thought that she was particularly skilled as an artist, and she was friends with Mamie Jellett, and they both sort of had a great regard for each other as well. And in addition to being a member of the Society of Dublin Painters, she also became interested in the White Stag Group through her relationship and friendship with Mamie Jellett, and exhibited with the White Stag Group while they were in Ireland for 4 times between 1941 and 1942. So just to give a wee bit of background about the White Stag Group, they were founded in 1935 by Basil Rakazi and Kenneth Hall, and consisted of Irish expatriates returning home to avoid World War II, as well as English and French people who were also avoiding the war. And they introduced some of the most innovative painting that was seen in Ireland at that time. And just in terms of Dorothy Blackham's connection to the group, one of the founders of the movement, Rakazi, stayed with Dorothy and Thea Blackham in Alkel in July 1940, and I believe as well from 1940 to 1941 at Kiel, which is what we're looking at a painting of here on the canvas. So he would have stayed in this area with them, which is also where Thea Blackham ultimately settled. So she was certainly influential in her time, and certainly hanging out in the company of a lot of influential people who are perhaps now more well-known than she herself is. Ultimately, though, Dorothy Blackham spent a good period of the time from 1939 to 1945 working in Derry in the Gibraltarian evacuation camp there, teaching art classes to the refugees from Gibraltar there. And one of the reasons why she ended up working there is because Nightingale Hall, where she had her primary teaching post, had closed during the war. And though she was also teaching at other schools in Dublin, she'd had the most work at Nightingale Hall. So when it was closed, she decided to go up north to teach in the camps. And according to her own account of the time there, she ran drawing classes in 3 of the camps near Derry until the war was over and the evacuees returned home. And in addition to this being sort of an interesting point in Dorothy Blackham's biography, I think it's also sort of indicative of her personality or of her character. She seems to have been remembered as a very charitable person who was definitely interested in the people around her, a real sort of humanitarian figure. And I think that this sort of speaks to that. This period is also thought to be the time that Dorothy Blackham began corresponding with her future husband as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about Dorothy Blackham's relationship with her husband Elsner Stewart later, but that's who she married following World War II. And it's thought, at least by Dr. Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, that their courtship might have begun during the wartime period. Elsner was serving in the Indian Army in World War II and was working in India as an intelligence officer. And it's sort of supposed that maybe they began a courtship at this time through writing each other letters. And just to say as well, on a separate note, that the painting that we're looking at is, I think, the first work of watercolor on paper that we've looked at so far in our talk about Dorothy Blackham today. And she was particularly well known for her works in watercolor as well as in oil. And I think that this work, which is called November in the Suburbs, is a really great example of one of her watercolors. And so in the interest in, I suppose, trying to get a sense of Dorothy Blackham's artistic practice, while she was primarily a landscape painter working in oils and in watercolor, as we've seen, she also worked effectively in tempera, as we've seen from the painting that's the subject of this conversation. She worked in chalk and pastel, but she was also quite proficient and prolific in lithography and scraperboard as well. And she created scraperboard drawings for the Belle magazine and experimented with lino cuts, creating large landscape prints out of these as well. And she used this technique along with woodcuts, which we're looking at an example of here, to make illustrations and greeting cards with the koala press, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. She's also sort of, I'd say, well known for her lino cuts, which are usually in black and white or sometimes in 2 or 3 colors. So the work we're looking at here right now is our first example, is a woodcut depicting nets and currachs in Achill. So also another depiction of Achill, which we see a lot throughout her work and where she seems to have spent a good bit of her time as well. So here's a few more examples of work of illustrations that Dorothy Blackham did with the koala press. And she was friends with Lily and Lolly Yates, in addition to all of the other prominent figures that we've already mentioned that she was friends with. And she did a number of designs for the Yates sisters for both the koala and the Cluna presses. And this, I think, also really spoke to an interest that she developed while she was training at the RHA, which was in poster design. So I think we really see that graphic quality of her work here, which she really seems to excel in. And I would argue as well that this graphic quality also extends to the style that we see in Marionettes at the Window and in some other works of hers that we'll look at also. She seems to have been a very sort of graphic artist, not particularly well versed in portraiture, we'll say, or depicting the human form in that way, but in this more sort of illustrative quality that we see in the human figures in the work at the right here. So perhaps less details to them, and it's more about shape, movement, color, and illustration. In addition to works like these with the koala press, Dorothy Blackham also did things like making Christmas cards and designing for designs for wrapping paper and box tops for the ornamental boxes that sweets or biscuit tins would come in that would then be kept and saved as sort of decorative storage items by people later. So all of this is just to say that her art was probably quite widely enjoyed by a wide variety of people, in addition to sort of people who would have been in the arts and in the art scene and looking at paintings and things of that nature. All of this sort of graphic and print work that Dorothy Blackham did as well would have been enjoyed by the vast majority probably of people throughout Ireland who may not have known her name but would have been familiar with her drawings through her designs for book covers, calendars, posters, magazines, and the like. And just as another example of how involved Dorothy Blackham was with the Yates sisters and their work with the koala and Cluna presses, this is an example of a needlework panel that was created by Lily Yates, but the design was drawn by Dorothy Blackham. And in a letter that Dorothy Blackham wrote to one of the former curators and directors of the Hugh Lane Gallery, Ethna Waldron, when she had written to her asking for some autobiographical information about her as she was a part of the collection, in a note back to her, she wrote, When in Dublin, I had quite a lot of work for Miss Yates at the Koala Press, also sometimes working drawings for embroidery for Miss L. Yates, as she was then something of an invalid. I did drops for her to embroider of the Abbey Theatre and Customs House. So what we're looking at here is a needlework panel of the GPO, so we can assume this was a similar sort of commission or collaboration in which she did the, I guess, preliminary drawing for the work that Lily Yates then carried out in her needlework. And I suppose this would also speak to sort of the collaborative environment of the Koala Press as well, women working together, teaching each other, and sort of carrying on these industries in that way. And so I did want to take a moment to look at these artworks here, because I think that particularly the artwork on the left of the screen, which is, I believe, a watercolor and perhaps charcoal on paper called A Quiet Time, is particularly interesting in conjunction with the other works of Dorothy Blackham's that I came across as I was researching her. This seems to be one of the only sorts of portraits that she's done, and I think that that's interesting, and I was sort of wondering why she never worked in portraits, whether it was a particular aesthetic opinion, she wasn't interested in that as a term in terms of subject matter, or if it was for some other reason, because she does seem to have been a sensitive and observant person who had a lot of friends, so she was very interested in, I think, the human spirit and in different characters. It's in one of the sort of in memoriam articles that was written after her death, the person writing about her wrote, "One was always enriched by conversation with her, as she spoke of the interesting people she had met in life, and also in her concern for all of those whom she had come to know." So she definitely had, I think, an interest in people and humanity, but she seems to have preferred to have depicted the landscape, or to have depicted the human figure in more of an illustrative manner, such as the illustration that we're looking at on the right here. Which is a hand-colored illustration that was one of the Christmas cards, I believe, issued by the Koala Press. Anyways, looking at the portrait, shall we say, on the left of the screen, I'd say, while it's not perhaps particularly as technically adept as maybe some of Dorothy Blackham's contemporaries, I think it does give us a sense of this interest in the human spirit. It seems to be a very quiet and intimate scene where she's capturing a figure who's either in the midst of reading or writing, but we do, I think, get, though it's not, technically perfect, we do get a sense of this, of a sense of interiority, of a person lost in thought that I think is captured quite well. But overall, though, in terms of artistic style, it seems that a more illustrative or more graphic style is really what suited her and the style that she sort of flourished within. So looking more at this, I would say, sort of more graphic style, this is the second work of Dorothy, or the other work of Dorothy Blackham's that's part of the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, and it's called House Painting in Paddington, and it's a work of watercolor on paper, and I would say a very excellent example of one of Dorothy Blackham's watercolors. This painting was in the exhibition Irish Women Artists from 18th century to the present day, which was that exhibition put on by the National Gallery of Ireland and the Douglas Hyde Gallery, and I believe it was 1987. So they borrowed this work from the Hugh Lane Gallery to be part of that exhibition, and that's the way in which Dorothy Blackham was represented in that exhibition. It's thought that based on the composition of the watercolor, the artist seems to have been viewing a scene from a balcony opposite of the house being painted, and it's thought that this was the artist's studio in London, so in the Paddington neighborhood of London. So it's thought that she's looking out from a balcony off of her artist's studio to this house across the way. And just sort of, again, looking at the way that Dorothy Blackham draws the human figure, it's interesting, I think, as well to note here that the architecture and the way that it's been rendered is quite detailed and realistic, while her treatment of the human figures is highly stylized and sort of has that more kind of basic illustrative nature to it. Another point that I think is noteworthy in terms of the graphic nature of this particular watercolor is the striking contrast that's created by the the silhouette of the dark ornamental iron balcony from where the artist presumably is painting from against the pale gray of the stone building across the way. And so I think that this is a really great example both of her proficiency in watercolor as well as her abilities as an illustrator and an illustrative artist. I mean, just the sheer amount of detail in this image is just impressive and gorgeous. So looking at Marionettes at the Window in conjunction with House Painting in Paddington, both of which are in the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, I think we can see a sort of relationship between the two paintings in a few different ways. So first off, it appears that the view that we're looking at through the window in Marionettes at the Window, that cityscape that I mentioned, that we're looking at sort of from almost not a bird's eye view, but a high up view, we'll say, of seems to be from the house in Paddington as well. So it seems like they were both painted or at least depict the same sort of location, though I would say that the window that we're looking at that the marionettes are sort of suspended in front of would perhaps be higher up in the building than the balcony, which is our view from the house in the house painting in Paddington across the street there. But in addition to them showing views of sort of similar, of different views of the same area of London, I think that we also get a really strong sense of Dorothy Blackham's talent as a graphic artist as well. And her work overall seems to have been characterized by strong qualities and strong attention to and talent in drawing, and bold lines as well as bold and delicate color as well. So she just, as I mentioned before, seems to have a very good facility with her use of color. And I think that both of these are a really great example of that in terms of the vibrancy of the colors used in the costumes of the marionettes and Marionettes at the Window, as well as the painting of the window itself, and even these subtle sort of lavender and orange colored shadows that we see both around the cityscape that we're looking at through the view of the window that the marionettes are in front of, as well as similar kinds of colors and shadows that we're seeing towards the middle section of the painting of House Painting in Paddington. There's a lot of those similar kind of blue and orangey, almost like sunset colors that we're getting through there that really give us an idea of the quality of light at the time of day that the artist is depicting. And as I mentioned earlier, both of these works were donated to the gallery on behalf of Dorothy Blackham's sister, Thea. And I think that there was a certain, perhaps, and I'm just making a supposition here, I'm just kind of hypothesizing, but I think that there is perhaps even like an element of curation that Thea had in deciding to pick these two works in particular to donate to the gallery as an example of her sister's work. I think that they work together well, and that they stand apart as really high quality examples of her talent as a graphic artist and in the illustrative style as well, even though they aren't examples of landscapes, which is perhaps what she was maybe more well known for, at least in terms of the articles and clippings and whatnot that we have of people writing about Dorothy Blackham's work. So just a couple more notes about Dorothy Blackham's biography before we wrap up here. So she and her husband, Elsner Stewart, relocated to London after World War II, but ultimately moved back to Ireland in 1967, settling in County Down. And though the two weren't married until after the war, when both of them were middle-aged, I do think it's worth noting that, at least by one biographer's account, they said that as an example of a happy marriage, theirs was second to none, and that this really showed in their later years in life as well. And in that sort of in memoriam piece written by Dr. Fitzpatrick in memoriam of Dorothy Blackham after her passing, she ends her article by saying, "I cannot close without recording the great nobility of character which Dorothy showed during her husband's final illness. By this time in 1974, she herself was much crippled by arthritis and was physically too incapacitated to nurse him herself. Yet it was the wish of both that he should remain at home. The gratitude and generous grace with which she allowed others to take her place I shall not easily forget." So just sort of, I think, another anecdote speaking to Dorothy Blackham's character. And then in her last letter that Dorothy Blackham wrote to Dr. Elizabeth Fitzpatrick, she wrote, "I spend my days drawing little pictures as presents for those kind girls, the nurses." So we really see Dorothy Blackham interested in the people around her, and even interested in a way in sort of teaching and imparting knowledge, or even the joy of drawing, right up until the end of her life. And she passed away just over a year after her husband passed away. So she passed away in 1975 in Donaghadee County Down, where the two had, as I said, relocated to. And just maybe as one final note, even in her obituary, it closes by saying, "By request, donations in lieu of flowers have been sent to Marie Curie Trust." So just sort of interested in giving back to her community and community service really right up until the end of her life. And so I'll close with another quote by one of Dorothy Blockham's biographers, which said, "There seems to be nothing that Dorothy Blackham touched that she did not adorn, and there is mighty little that she did not touch." And I think that sums things up nicely. So we'll leave it at that. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for tuning in to today's coffee conversation. And I look forward to chatting to you all a bit more about Dorothy Blackham and Marionettes at the Window in particular. Cheers.